Hello everyone.
And welcome to Dad
And me
Love History.
Dad and me love a whole lot of history. We could be the greatest team that the world has ever seen. Dad and me love a whole lot of history.
So today we're all about the Cold War. When did it happen? What happened during the Cold War? How and why did it happen? Shout out to my Year 10s who are studying this period of history right now. Let's start with when. What do you know, James, about when the Cold War occurred?
Was it around the 1950s?
Yeah, pretty close. So the Cold War was a period of tension from around, particularly from 1945, around the end of World War II, through to 1990 or 1991, when the Soviet Union stopped being communist and became Russia, as we call it today.
They were the same team in World War II trying to fight Nazi Germany, but they were always suspicious of each other.
Yeah, that's right. Of course, the Soviet Union and the USA were actually on the same side in World War II. Although, let's be honest, that's because Hitler declared war on both of them, so they were forced to be on the same side.
And why and how did the Cold War happen?
Why? Well, the USA and its friends believed in democracy and in freedom, for example, to make money, which also meant the freedom for some people to be poor, other people to be rich. Whereas the Soviet Union, also known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, they believed in communism. They were the first country on earth to become communist, and they believed everything should be shared out equally. How did it happen? Well, these two sides, communists versus capitalist democracies, both sides tried to influence as much of the world as they could. They both felt like the other side was trying to take over their world and make big empires for themselves, so they both had suspicions about the other side. And there's kind of reasons why. On the Russian side, or the Soviet side I should say, for example, the USSR or Soviet Union took over Eastern Europe at the end of World War II. And they forced countries like Hungary and Poland, for example, to be ruled by communists. The communist parties were put in power there, and Soviet tanks and troops kind of backed them up.
What's the difference between the Soviet Union back then and Russia today?
Well, Russia today isn't communist, although its president, Vladimir Putin, was a leading communist in the Cold War days. He was in charge of the KGB, the Communist Secret Police. So he certainly was a communist, and a lot of his critics, a lot of people around the world would say he runs Russia in a kind of similar way. And if he hears things he doesn't like, chances are that person's either going to get arrested or disappear. So that happened during the Cold War, if people said things the communists didn't like. And although it doesn't happen maybe quite so much today, it's still happening. Russia today is a geographically, size-wise smaller version of the Soviet Union. When Russia was run by communists, the communists basically took over all their neighbours, or many of them, from Ukraine, Georgia, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and so on. And today, all those places I just mentioned, they're all separate countries. So Russia today, one difference is that it's a smaller version.
Why was the Cold War considered a war?
Really good question. Well, that brings us to the problem with calling the Cold War the Cold War.
What's the problem?
It wasn't always a cold war. So Cold War is kind of meaning like there's this cold tension between two sides. You could describe two people as being cold to each other. That doesn't mean that they're physically fighting each other. It means more like they're maybe being unfriendly, but not fighting. The problem with the Cold War is that it wasn't always cold. For example, the USA, housed by Australia, sent troops to Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s to try to stop Vietnam from becoming controlled by the Vietnamese Communist Party, who were backed up by the Soviet Union. So the two sides, communists against non-communists, they fought over control of Vietnam. That's the Vietnam War. In fact, we did a whole episode on the Vietnam War, episode 37. The USA and friends did a similar thing earlier in the 1950s in Korea. At the end of World War II, it wasn't clear what type of government was going to rule over Korea. Some people wanted communists, some people wanted a more democratic style like the USA, Australia. And so the USA sent troops to back the South, who fought against the North, who were communists in the North. And the North was backed by the Soviet Union and Communist China. China, of course, is still communist today. So anyway, the point is that in Korea and Vietnam, for example, the Cold War became hot, really hot.
That sounds mad.
Do you know, it's funny you should say that, because the whole thing was M.A.D, mad. Because both sides had a lot, and I mean a lot, of nuclear weapons, so put on rockets that you could just fire thousands of miles away. By the 1960s, they had enough to blow up the whole world. So if World War III broke out, most of the world would probably be destroyed. And this was called MAD. Mutually, which means kind of both, as in both sides. Assured, so M for mutually, A assured, so like definite, and D, destruction. MAD, mutually assured destruction. If one side fired a nuclear rocket, it would take a few hours to get to the other country, and the other side had like satellite radar, and they would see the missiles coming, so they would press their own fire button, launch their own missiles, and then the first side would fire more, and both sides would be destroyed. Not just America, but its friends in Europe as well.
Meaning everyone in the world would have died in World War III if that happened.
Yeah, pretty much.
They weren't only fighting for countries to be communist. They were also trying to get the first people into space.
Oh yeah. So there was this whole space race going on between the two sides as well.
Yeah, so Russia got the first thing into space. It was like antenna.
A satellite?
Yeah, satellite.
Yeah.
Then they got the first spaceship with a human in it. But the USA did get the first man in the moon.
And that technology that they used to develop space rockets was similar to the rocket technology that they used for their missiles. So they kind of helped each other. And do you know that the world actually came pretty close to World War III? It's the closest the world ever came, in my opinion, as a historian and history teacher, to World War III. And that takes us to a place called Cuba in 1962. So Cuba is only 90 miles, what would that be? I guess like 140 kilometers from the USA. In the late 1950s, Cuba had a revolution and became communist, and then became very friendly, of course, with the Soviet Union, which was like seen as the world leader of communism. And the Soviet Union secretly put nuclear missiles onto the island of Cuba and literally physically pointed them, aimed them at US cities. This would enable the Soviet Union to destroy key US cities and military bases much more quickly than if it fired missiles from the Soviet Union, which was much further away. So if there was going to be a war, the Soviet Union, the idea was, could win it quickly before America would have much chance to retaliate and send its own missiles. However, the Americans sent over a U-2 spy plane, has amazing technology and cameras on it so it can spy from high distances. And the Americans discovered from the photos all of the key signs of nuclear missiles that could be launched and were physically, like the launch sites were physically aimed and pointing at the USA. So what to do about it was the big question. JFK, by the way, John F. Kennedy was president of the USA at the time, and Khrushchev was president of the USSR. What do you think the Americans, what could they have done?
They could have got like the same sort of weapons and directed them to where they were going to be launched, but not actually launch them.
Yeah, so they could have responded with a similar threat to make it really clear that, look, if you even think about it, Cuba's not a huge country, so they could put nuclear weapons down in Florida, which is the nearest bit of the US to Cuba, point them at Cuba, and maybe even tell Cuba, look, we've got these weapons ready to destroy your whole country. That's one thing they could have done. There was always this risk that somebody would fire a nuclear weapon or would fire some other sort of rocket or weapon, and the other side thinks it's a nuclear one. But to go back to what JFK did actually do, so John F. Kennedy, he was getting all sorts of advice along the lines of, well, why we have to strike them now, because if they fire, they could fire any time, and then we're going to lose millions of lives. So some of the military advice was, let's strike Cuba straight away. Others was, let's strike the Soviet Union, because we know they're Soviet missiles. And they knew Cuba didn't have that technology of its own anyway. But what they did in the end was a little bit cleverer. They immediately, the Americans, sent out their fleet of ships, because they already had Navy ships kind of in the area, and they sent more and more to completely surround Cuba, because Cuba's an island. It was called a blockade, to stop any ships going in or out. So for starters, that meant that any supplies that were needed, they couldn't get in. Cuba would know they were cornered, and of course JFK contacted the communist president of Russia, Khrushchev, and said, look, we know you've got those missiles there. This was all secret conversations. In the end, Khrushchev was like, yeah, what are you going to kind of give me if I remove those missiles? Because you've got missiles in Turkey, which is a bit too close to Russia for our liking. So they made a secret deal. The USA promised within a year to withdraw its missiles from Turkey if the Russians or Soviets withdrew their missiles from Cuba, which they did do. So for about 10 days in October 1962, when all that played out, that was the closest the world had come to World War III, to the presidents on either side pressing the red button and firing nuclear weapons. Certainly the closest that we know of. Could be more secrets out there, including who killed JFK, hey, listener? That's another episode for another time. So just about to bring things to a conclusion, there's plenty going on in the world today that's kind of same or similar to how it was during the Cold War. You've got North Korea that we mentioned earlier is still communist today. South Korea is capitalist and democratic because that Korean War from 1950 to 53 ended in a draw, and so it's still a draw today. Vietnam is communist because the communists won the Vietnam War. The Americans withdrew, and then of course the communists took over all of Vietnam. So and Cuba, like we mentioned a minute ago, is still communist today, and there's still tension at times between Cuba and America in particular. So there's still some things there. What there's not is any significant threat of a nuclear war. So do not have nightmares. The world is a very different place, and in that sense, a much better place than it was over 30 years ago. So we've learned all about the Cold War today. What do you think's the most important bit?
Probably what J.F. Kennedy did. How he didn't actually attack Cuba, but blocked everything coming in and out.
Yeah, and that was enough to make the Russians and Cuban leaders know that they were kind of cornered and to back down. And it was a clever way of doing it because it was the lowest risk. Other options risked World War III. And it also makes you think, if you'd had a different leader, I'm not going to mention any names, but surely there would have been some US presidents we can think of that would have probably been more likely to have just said, yeah, let's just fire some missiles at them. Anyway, listener, please share our podcast on social media and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
And tell us what you think on Facebook.
And Instagram.
And Twitter. Bye for now.
From Dad.
And me.
Love history.
Dad and me love a whole lot of history. We could be the greatest team that the world has ever seen. Dad and me love a whole lot of history.
Here are some questions to see how well you understood today's episode.
Number 1. When did the Cold War begin and end?
Number 2. Why is it called the Cold War?
Number 3. Where did the Cold War become hot?
Number 4. What's the difference between the Soviet Union during the Cold War and Russia today?
What was M.A.D? M.A.D.
And finally, question 6. What's going on in the world today that is the same or similar to how it was during the Cold War?
Hello?
Right, we're in business. And we'll see if the listener can tell that we're not actually using a professional mic because we've moved house and can't find it. Put a bit of backing music on it and she'll be right, mate.
Hello, everyone.
That's me just knocking my phone on the floor, which, because we've lost the mic, is an issue because we're using the phone as a mic. Let's try that again.
Hello, everyone.
And welcome to Dad
And me
Love History.
If Russian troops trained in the cold, how would they lose the Cold War?
I don't know. If Russian troops train in the cold, and it is cold in Russia, I don't know, how would they lose the Cold War?
That's still...
Oh, I see. Russia's famously cold.
So why is it called the Cold War?
Yeah, I see what you mean. We kind of only half answer that. There was that kind of cold tension going on throughout the whole period, but there was also the hot moments that we've mentioned. But the way I'm going to answer that, why is it called the Cold War, is to tell you where it comes from. Now, the other day when we were in the car, James was asking me, who's your favourite authors, what's your favourite books, and we went through all sorts of different types of books and authors. But one I mentioned, coincidentally, was George Orwell. And George Orwell wrote books in the sort of around the 1940s in particular, and just before that, where he, looking back, he predicted the future. 1984 was his most famous book, when it was published in 1948, and he was predicting what the Cold War would look like by the 1980s, and he was pretty close. But even before 1948, when he wrote the 1984, he wrote a newspaper article in 1945. So he's like a journalist, writer. And he wrote a newspaper article, and he just invented, made up, used for the first time that was ever been used in kind of in writing or publicly that we know of, the term Cold War. And he said, so this is right at the end of World War II, and he said, look, if you look at how much the USA and friends and the Soviet Union and friends dislike each other, could say hate each other, then even though they're not actually fighting each other at this moment, this is like, and he said, a permanent state of Cold War. So he was saying it's like a tense situation that's going to last, he used the word permanent, but certainly going to last a long time. And he wasn't far wrong.